Hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I'm going to be explaining the Starlit Span Magus subclass in Pathfinder 2e at level 1. An overview of this video is I'm going to start by talking about the basics that you need to know if you're playing this subclass. These are what ability scores you should prioritize and what equipment is best for the class. Then I'll move into the main focus of the Magus class, which is spellcasting and Spellstrike, and various interactions of these different abilities with the base spellcasting and attacks. Then I have a couple of quick tips for playing the Magus based off things that I've frequently seen players forget. And finally, I'll talk a bit about the party role and teamwork abilities of the Starlit Span Magus. As a note, this is not so much a team class as a lot of other subclasses in Pathfinder, because it's very focused on making what you personally do effective. Okay, so the absolute basics here are, with Starlit Span Magus, you're essentially building a ranged Magus. It's the only subclass that really does ranged attacks effectively. So, your primary ability score is Dexterity, which is always used for ranged attacks. And you should remember that and get it to the +4. You have a secondary ability score, which you cannot change, of Intelligence. This score is your spellcasting-based ability. It might become a primary ability if you're intending to use a lot of save-based spells, because Intelligence determines your spell save DC, which is the number enemies have to roll over to successfully save against your spell. All of the other statistics are really tertiary in that you don't have to specifically prioritize one or the other in every build, but you might want to consider certain uses for these, such as Constitution always being useful for some extra durability, Strength you might want at a +1 so that you can have a slightly heavier armor, or you might want Wisdom or Charisma higher. For skills, you are automatically granted Arcana, which again indicates the Intelligence synergy for out-of-combat recall knowledge. And you also get an additional 2+ Intelligence skills. So if you absolutely go hard into Intelligence, you're going to have a total of 6 skills. I would suggest focusing on out-of-combat uses of these skills because the Starlit Span and the Magus in general is very action-hungry with just the abilities given by the class. So you won't really have a lot of extra actions to use various skills for. But if you want to go heavily into one, you can. It's not particularly bad. It's just you want to use your abilities over just any other ability. However, some combats might make your abilities less useful, in which case having a backup skill or two could be very useful to you. So on the equipment front, for the Starlit Span, I would suggest using light armor. This is because it has a low strength requirement, a low armor check penalty, and you get the same AC as you do with medium armor at a lower cost as long as you have +4 dexterity. Which, that +4 dexterity is pretty much assumed for the Starlit Span because you're doing ranged damage. Now, on the topic of weapon traits, one good trait to look out for is deadly and fatal weapons. However, you should not prioritize this or the potentially useful traits over avoiding the bad trait. So, you might want that so that your crits can do even more damage, because the Magus is a very crit-focused class in some ways, in that all your biggest damage shots will be critical hits. Depending on your build, you might also find the propulsive trait, which adds half of your strength to damage, or the parry trait, which lets you essentially have a shield as an extra little thing you can use for some AC, to be useful traits. There are other traits also found on some other weapons, such as the thrown weapon trait or the ranged trip trait, but these weapons frequently have the bad trait of reload. So, a potentially bad trait that you might end up grabbing is the volley trait. The volley trait is a mixed bag, so if you have a weapon with it, you might want to pick up one without it. Essentially, the way volley works is there's a certain range given by the trait. For example, the longbow has volley 30 feet. When you use the weapon to shoot an enemy within 30 feet, it has a penalty to hit. So that makes it bad at close range. If you're doing most adventure paths, you probably don't want to have the volley trait because of how common close quarters are. But having the extra range can be useful to deliver a Spellstrike. So if you do want to have a longbow, you might want it to also pick up a sling or a short bow just so you have a backup. Now, I really want to hammer this in. The one bad trait you do not want on your weapon as a Magus is reload. This is because reload means you have to spend actions to reload your weapon. And those are actions that you could be using to cast a spell, or Spellstrike, or recharge your Spellstrike, or move. And it really ties up your action economy in a way which is particularly damaging for the Magus because you already have a very tight action economy. The majority of ranged weapons in Pathfinder have the reload trait because pretty much every firearm has it, as well as most crossbows. So I would suggest when you're picking your weapon, go on Archives of Nessus and explicitly filter out the reload trait so that you're not suffering in combat from having it. I have seen players regret it because it does just make it hard to use your abilities. Now I'm moving on to the spellcasting abilities. I will warn this section is somewhat long because there's a lot of complexity. So to start, the main ability of the Magus class is the Spellstrike. The way Spellstrike works is essentially it lets you combine a spell with your attack roll. The basic structure of it is first you make an attack roll. The attack gains the Arcane trait. When you're playing as a Starlit Span Magus, these are ranged. No other Magus subclass can do ranged spell strikes, but you can, so make sure that you take advantage of that. Then, free here is you use a 1 to 2 action spell. You select this concurrently with the attack roll. The spell takes no additional actions, so if you're using a 2 action spell, with Spellstrike, you still only use 2 actions total. And in it, you get to attack and deliver your spell with the Spellstrike. So this can be more efficient, especially for attack spells. Then, after your Spellstrike either lands or misses, you gain 2 multi-attack penalty. So it's as if you made 2 attacks, even though you only made 1. But you got to deliver the spell, so that's why. And then, you cannot use Spellstrike again until it is recharged. Now, I'm going to move on here and say there are a lot of little specific rules with Spellstrike, and this is a bit of a distillation. I would still recommend reading all of them. The list is about as many bullet points as I have here. So first off, regardless of what spell you pick, Spellstrike only hits 1 target. This includes the spell and the attack. If the spell used to attack hits multiple targets, then it still only affects that target, and if it affects an area, then it only affects that target's space. So you can apply difficult terrain in the target square with Vine Trap, but you do not apply it over the full range as is normal. Then, the reach of the Spellstrike is that of the weapon, not the spell. So if your spell has a range of touch, then as a Starlit Span, you have the range of your entire ranged weapon. So if you're using a longbow, you can shoot within 100 feet of range. It's the first range increment of the weapon, to be clear. So 100 feet of range, even if the spell is normally touch range. The attack roll for the spell and weapon attack is combined if the spell causes an attack roll. So generally you should have a couple of spells that force attack rolls rather than just saves, because if the spell triggers a save, then the target still has to roll the save and you do not automatically succeed. So if it forces a reflex save, they have to make a reflex save after you've hit them, and the spell does not succeed until you both hit them and they fail the reflex save. Finally, the most common restriction is with Spellstrike, whatever spell you use must be 1, 2, or 1 or 2 actions. You cannot use a free action spell, or anything that is not specifically one of those numbers. You can choose the number of actions for variable action spells, but it must be within the range of 1 to 2 actions. Finally, Spell Shape does not work with Spellstrike, but that's not as common a rule to run into at low levels. Alright, so just a quick reminder here on how spells interact with Spellstrike. Spells which target AC combine the weapon attack with your weapon attack. So you shoot them and add a gouging claw to that. Then if you hit, you apply both gouging claw and the attack at whatever you rolled. So if it's a critical hit, then you get to apply the critical effect of the spell and the weapon strike separately. The weapon attack determines whether or not the spell targeting AC succeeds. You do not get to roll twice. But that can be an advantage because it means you get to use dexterity, which you have a higher score on than intelligence. And it's delivered at the range of your weapon, not the range of the spell. Then, if the spell instead targeted a save, you still deliver it on a successful strike, but it forces the save. And the effects only target the target. So if you shoot one goblin, then it forces the goblin to make the save, but it does not affect the two people next to him, even if it's area of effect. So, since I mentioned before, you need to recharge Spellstrike after you've used it. There's two ways you can do that I'll mention here. The first is to use the recharge action. This is just one action, you get it back. The second is to cast a conflux spell, which is a special type of focus spell which every Magus subclass has access to, which has a casting time of at least one action. So for Starlit Span, that is Shooting Star, and I will be talking about that in a minute. But first, I want to talk a bit about Arcane Cascade. It takes one action to activate this, and it is a stance. To activate Arcane Cascade, you have to have just cast a spell, which is not a complex spell, or you have to have just made a Spellstrike. So if your last action was to cast Ignition, then you could use Arcane Cascade, but you could do the same if Ignition was tied in with your Spellstrike. The effect of Arcane Cascade is while you are in the stance, the spell deals extra damage. At level 1, it's +1 damage of either the type that the attack spell you just cast dealt. So if it's Ignition, it deals +1 fire damage, whereas if it's Acid Splash, it deals +1 acid damage. Or if the spell did not deal damage, then you gain +1 force damage. And this lasts until the end of combat or until you're knocked out. So this means one synergy that you can potentially take advantage of is at the start of combat, you could cast a buff spell and then activate Arcane Cascade. That means next turn when you make a spell strike, you gain a +1 damage of the force damage type against whatever you hit. And this extra damage can add up, but it's especially strong if you can use it to take advantage of a weakness. So, for example, if you're fighting an enemy with weakness to fire damage, then you could cast Ignition, one action, then cast Arcane Cascade and gain fire damage, and that +1 damage will turn into +1 plus whatever the vulnerability of the target is. And it can also let you avoid somewhat the penalization of your weapon, even though your weapon is made magical. For instance, if the enemy is resistant to piercing damage, which most ranged weapons deal, then you could add that extra force damage to make up for the damage lost from using piercing damage. Arcane Cascade can also be tied with conflux spells to create the full power of the Magus. So the way that the Shooting Star conflux spell works, which this action does recharge Spellstrike, just to be clear, is with one action, you must be holding a ranged weapon and you must be able to cast verbal components. The way it works is you make a ranged strike versus the target. You get to ignore concealment and reduce the target's cover by 1 degree. So if a goblin's hiding behind something or you're trying to shoot them, you can ignore their concealment and reduce the target's cover by 1 degree. So if it's half cover, you reduce it to less than that. On a hit, anyone attacking the enemy gains the same benefit until the start of your next turn. So this advantage means that you can essentially make it so that all your allies are likelier to hit an enemy as well. With conflux spells, it works like any focus spell where you spend the focus point to cast it, and then you lose that until the end of combat, after which you can recharge it. So now, some quick tips for playing the Starlit Span Magus. First off, you should always use Spellstrike as the first action of your turn if you're going to Spellstrike in a certain turn, because it is a very high damage vehicle, and if you're spending a spell slot, you don't want to miss. And having a -5 to your attack is fairly significant, because the Spellstrike is essentially tying together both the spell and the attack, so you can combine the damage with one hit, and you want the best chance you have to land it. Second, remember that you don't have to Spellstrike every single turn. The Starlit Span is one of the few Magus subclasses that actually can do it, but is not usually a good idea because your other abilities of the Shooting Star and Arcane Cascade are also useful to have, in that you can use them together to create a far more potent effect than just shooting and Spellstriking every turn. You should remember to use those abilities and not just rely upon Spellstrike, no matter how tempting it is. And I would also suggest having a mix of damage types available to you in your spell selection. For instance, picking up both Acid Splash and Ignition rather than just one of them, so you can deal a variety of damage types and hopefully target your enemy's vulnerabilities. For party roll and teamwork, the Starlit Span Magus is 100% a single target damage dealer who works at range. If you want a non-ranged single target damage dealer of a Magus, you should choose another subclass. Some tips for teamwork as the Starlit Span is, first off, you should use Spellstrike to deliver short-range spells to enemies. So, for instance, you could use it to shoot an enemy and deliver a debuff from a range farther than any other caster, because you have more range using a longbow or some other long-range ranged weapon. Second, because this isn't really so much a teamwork class, you are relying on other party members to support you, because Spellstrike criticals are extremely high damage, with an application of both the spell critical effect and the weapon critical effect. So this can result in double damage for both from one successful strike, or you could even apply other effects using it. Thank you for watching. I hope this helped you understand how to play the Starlit Span Magus.